Dr. Calvin Odero, who is extension weed specialist here at the center. And most of y'all present here in the room know Dr. Odero, interacted with him. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Odero for his presentation. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Can you hear me? All right. Good morning once again, and thank you, Django, for the introduction. Most of you know who I am. I'm Calvin Odero. I'm an extension weed specialist based here at the EREC. I've been here since 2010, so the last 14 years. So it looks like I just started the other day. So today I'll give you an overview of some of the weed management programs that I run for crops that are grown here in the Everglades agricultural area. Let me give you, so the outline, I'll start with talking about weed management, some of the weed management systems that I've worked on in sugarcane and some of the things that I'll be doing in the next couple of years or seasons here. Because sugarcane is the major crop that we have in the area, but other than sugarcane, I work on almost all the other crops. So I'll talk about some work I've done on rice and what I'll plan on continuing doing on rice with regard to weed management, sweet corn, lettuce, some snap bean, and the last 2 years I've done some work on celery. I'll probably be winding that up this year. And then just very briefly about my extension program. So as Django mentioned, I'm an extension weed specialist and professor here. I've got a 35% research appointment, so I work on all these crops. I don't know if there's anyone else who works on so many crops like I do, but I try my best to do what I can. And then most of my appointment is extension. So I got a 60% extension appointment. And then over the last probably 3 or so years, I had my extension appointment kind of reduced by 5%, where I have a service appointment where I serve as the associate center director. So that's a picture of myself in a sugarcane field, just to give you an idea of how some of these weed species can grow tall, or almost as tall as me. That's a field heavily infested with fall panicum. Yeah. So I'm not going to talk about sugarcane agronomy and all that, because I know majority of you know how the sugarcane crop grow, how it's cultivated and all the practices that are involved. But I'll give you an overview of I'll start with how, from the harvesting part. Majority of our sugarcane is burned prior to harvest. And what we end up with is usually, you end up with no straw, an exposed surface. So majority of the weeds that we find prevalent in our cropping system, the sugarcane cropping system, are mostly annual grasses that are small-seeded, and also small-seeded broadleaf weeds. But if you move into green cane harvesting, where you have a lot of trash or straw residue on the surface of the field, then in production systems where they've moved to that, you tend not to have too many small-seeded weeds, such as annual grasses or small broadleaf weeds. They tend to have mostly large-seeded broadleaf weeds. And the main reason for that is that, when you have a small seed with a lot of trash blanket on the surface of the soil, if it's a small seed with very limited energy reserve, so it's not going to be able to really grow and go through that trash, compared to a large seeded seed. So a lot of the morning glories, the seeds are larger, so they tend to be more prevalent in systems where they harvest green compared to systems where they burn. And I think as we start doing a lot more green cane harvesting, then I think there's going to be a shift in the population of weed species that we'll be seeing in the field, just because of the trash blanket that is not very favorable to some of the small-seeded annual weeds that we commonly see in our production system here. I put a list of some common weeds that you will find in the field, and I always like putting them when they're small like this. from the extension point of view, like if you're a grower and you want to control the weeds, I mean, you want to control them when they're this small. So some of the most prevalent ones are fall panicum for grasses. You'll find some crab grasses, goosegrass. These are sandbar, mostly. You'll find these majorly in mineral soils or some of our sandy soils. Crowfoot grass and Bermuda grass, which is a perennial grass. But typically, fall panicum is going to be the one that will be the most problematic in our sugarcane cropping system. We do have several broadleaf weeds that are associated with a cropping system in sugarcane. Different amaranthus species, spiny amaranth, which has some spines on it. That's why it's called spiny amaranth. The smooth pigweed. Common lambsquat is another one that is going to be prevalent in cane and also in other crops, as you'll see when I'll talk about the other crops. The American black nightshade is becoming very common in some of our fields when you walk around. Common ragweed, common parsley, and more here, livid amaranth. This, though, is not very competitive, but you'll still see a lot of it in our fields. And then there is ragweed parthenium that right now you see a little bit of encroachment into fields, even though it's majorly found along field edges or ditches and canals. But there are some areas where you can find a lot of it moving into the field. So it has a potential of becoming some major, a major weed species within the sugarcane cropping system in the future. But I'll talk about some of the management programs that are there that can be used to mitigate its effect on cane. And then we have two sages that are prevalent in our sugarcane production system, yellow nutsedge and purple nutsedge that you will also find common. So this is a picture of fall panicum that I mentioned is the most common and the most prevalent in our cropping system here. And this is a field that, if you delay applying some of the herbicides that are commonly used for fall panicum control, then you can end up with a field like this. So if you end up with a field like this, where you don't get adequate weed control, then this weed species does have a very negative effect on your sugarcane crop. So this is some data from a few years ago, where we looked at sugarcane stand and yield reduction as a function of increasing duration of fall panicum interference within the crop. So what we did here was to let fall panicum compete with sugarcane and then go and remove them from the field. I think it was from 2 weeks all the way until almost almost to the harvesting time. As you can see, these are old varieties. I don't think anyone still grows some of them. But the response of even some of the current varieties that we do have will be the same. So in a situation where you really don't control fall panicum that much, so if you look at your millable stalks or your cane yield loss, or even the sucrose yield loss, you can get up to 60% yield reduction. But based on all these three varieties, we determined that the critical timing of removal for these weeds was between 5 to 9 weeks. So you have to make sure your fields are free within that range to minimize that was to avoid about a 5 to 10% yield loss. So the goal of most weed management programs, usually if you say that I have a good weed management program, you're looking at least some 90% weed control should be good enough, because nothing is perfect. That's why it's control. So there's no way to completely eradicate a weed. So for fall panicum, the critical timing of removal usually is between 5 to 9 weeks. Sugarcane is very slow early in the season when it grows, and these weed species become very competitive if it's not controlled that early in the season. So this is just a chart here to show you, the sugarcane production, how sugarcane grows through the season, and the timing when you go in and control weeds. So most weed control is when we do planting or for platoon crops that when they regrow. So from planting to the point when sugarcane tillers, before it closes row, that's the amount of time or the window that you have that you can go in and control most of the annual or perennial weeds that might be present. So once the canopy closes, then typically later in the season, during maybe the sugarcane ground growth period or before it starts ripening and all that, a lot of issues that we will have will mostly be annual vines. And annual vines are mostly controlled using either some of the growth regulators like 2,4-D or dicamba that are mostly aerially sprayed. And then, of course, as sugarcane ripens and then it's harvested, when people start planting, then the weed control, starts coming, you start having your weed control program depending on whether you are having a new plant cane or whether it's some ratoon crop cane. So I'll go through some pre-emergence herbicides that are common or that are labeled for use in our area. There are not that very many. We've got, hope you can see this. We've got atrazine, which is mostly for broadleaf weed control, even though they say it might have some activity on some grasses, but not that much. Metribuzin, majorly for broadleaf weed control. Pendimethalin is for grass control. Mesotrione is labeled also for broadleaf weed control, even though not very many people use it as a pre-emergence product, but you can use it pre-emergence for broadleaf weed control on your sugarcane crop. So, and then one of the new, I would say, a newer compound that's been registered lately for use in sugarcane is S-metolachlor or dual. S-metolachlor or dual has been used in this area over a long period of time, mostly in sweet corn for weed management, but it got a registration as a premix of S-metolachlor, atrazine, and mesotrione, a product that is called Lumax that can be applied pre-emergence or early post-emergence for weed control. And a lot of our growers really don't use true pre-emergence weed control programs because typically when sugarcane is planted, sometimes it's very dry and most of the pre-emergence products require incorporation. But I've seen phases like this where, somebody is putting irrigation water because it's super dry. So in a situation like this, putting in a pre-emergence product to help you limit that initial flash of weeds can help because, you already have some water that can help you with incorporation. So we did some work. I had a student who worked on this. So we looked at field dissipation of S-metolachlor or dual in our soils just to look at its persistence over time. So this was on organic soil. The response was very linear, and there were differences. This was it was very wet. In this year, I forgot to put the years there, and it was a little bit cooler. So the half-life range from 50 to 126 days in mark soil, but that doesn't really translate into getting that huge duration of time with regard to weed control, because most of the product that will be there will not be available because a lot of it would be absorbed to the soil organic matter that you find in mark soils. But in sandy soils where there's no organic matter, the half-life for dual or S-metolachlor is very short, 12 to 24 days, because there's nothing that it attaches to. There's no organic matter in the soil. So its effect on controlling weeds, it's not going to be as pronounced as you might probably see in the organic or the mark soils. So right now, I know there are people who are using dual or S-metolachlor, not as a standalone product, but it comes in as a premix with, as I mentioned, with atrazine or mesotrione, or as a premix with metribuzin. And it's a product that is sold by Syngenta. So for post-emergence herbicides, there are several same herbicides that are used for the atrazine, metribuzin, and amitrine. Those are photosystem 2 inhibitors or triazine herbicides. They're very good for broadleaf weed control, even though metribuzin and amitrine can be used for grass control, especially when the grasses are still very small. Mesotrione is good for broadleaf weeds, 2,4-D, dicamba. Those are broadleaf weed products. And then azulam is the major herbicide that I would say that is very effective for annual grass control that we have in sugarcane. Trifloxysulfuron, which is en vogue, can also be used for for grasses. And typically, these two are tank mix to give that good efficacy when it comes, particularly to controlling things like fall panicum. And then if you have a lot of sages, we have halosulfuron that is very good for either yellow or purple nut sage control. And the latest compound that's been labeled or registered for use in cane is tropremazone or Amazon. This is a product that had been in the market most majorly for use in corn or corn production systems or sweet corn. And I remember we did start, I think I was doing some trials for BSF, and we had sprayed it over some Bermuda grass and showed some a little bit of good efficacy in that. And then after that, we tried it on cane and eventually had it registered for use in sugarcane as a compound that is very good for both broadleaf weeds and also for annual grass control, especially when the grasses are still small. So there's some work that we did to look at the effect of mostly tropremazone on fall panicum control. And tropremazone is in a group of, it's called a HPPD inhibitor. It causes bleaching on susceptible plants. And typically, there's a synergistic effect if it's tank mixed with either atrazine, amitrine, or metribuzin, which are triazines. So we did I had a graduate student who worked on this, looking at the effect of these tank mixes on fall panicum. And from this slide, the main thing was that, tropremazone plus metribuzin. So it can be applied at rates of, 25 or 50 grams of active ingredient per hectare. So it's a very, very low use rate or herbicide. But the tank mix with metribuzin did give very, very good control of fall panicum even at 70 days. The control was still about 83%, as you can see. This is the untreated control at 70 days, where you don't get not much gain, and then that is where you have that tank mix with metribuzin. So tropremazone, the best tank mixes is either with metribuzin if you're on mark soil or atrazine. But if you are on sandy soil where you cannot use metribuzin, then tank mixes with atrazine will still give you some good efficacy. But it only work on the weeds especially the grasses when they are small. So Asulam is usually like the standard sugarcane herbicide that is used, irrespective of the size of the fall panicum. You can spray Asulam even on fall panicum that is maybe 2 feet tall, and it still has an effect. But you don't want to wait until that point, because by then there'll be your tillers will be low and so forth. But this is a new product that is out there in the market now for our growers, and I think probably a lot of acreage now is treated with tropremazone, which is very good. So that added a new tool for our growers to use in the sugarcane crop. So one thing that tropremazone can do, it's been able to show some efficacy on Bermuda grass. It really doesn't kill it. If it's established Bermuda grass, what it's going to do, it'll just bleach it. But for Bermuda grass that is probably newly established from some runners that are not well established, let's say if you're moving from a fallow field and you're planting cane and you had a field that had a lot of Bermuda grass. So in cases where you have escapes, it's been shown to provide some good effect in managing Bermuda grass. So this is a study where we looked at newly established Bermuda grass control in response to tropremazone applied alone or in combination with the photosystem 2 inhibitor herbicides. And if you remember, tropremazone plus metribuzin provided the best control of Bermuda grass. And for fall panicum, and for Bermuda grass that is newly established, if you use that same combination, what we did was to look at the probability of survival of the fall panicum about almost over 70 days after treatment, and chances of the plants regrowing was only 23% with metribuzin. So that's a huge effect from the point of view where you are trying to reduce the population to ensure that it doesn't really have that negative effect. So might not completely kill the plant. It might regrow, but by the time it starts regrowing, I mean, you'll be having that sugarcane canopy already covering over the rows to ensure that it doesn't grow that much. I mentioned this is ragweed parthenium that is becoming very common, kind of encroaching into some of the sugarcane fields. But the good news is that almost majority of the broadleaf weed herbicides that we have are very effective on it. So it's probably not going to be a problem as long as we still have all these compounds that are labeled for use in sugarcane. So tropramazone, which is new, is very good on it. If you combine tropramazone with some of the triazines or even some of the triazines alone, will give very good control. And then the premix of S-metolachlor, atrazine, and metribuzin also provides very good control of ragweed parthenium. So a lot of weeds, when people talk about weeds, in the Midwest, where they grow a lot of corn, soybean, there are a lot of herbicide-resistant weeds. Luckily, over here, we don't have, so far, I've not seen any weed that is resistant within the cropping systems. But we do have ragweed parthenium as being resistant to glyphosate. Because glyphosate is used to control weeds along non-crop areas. So the population that we have here is highly resistant to glyphosate. But the good thing, if it moves into the sugarcane crop, then all the herbicides that we have here will do a very good job in controlling it. So going back to fall panicum, there have been times where some growers have talked about Azulam, which I mentioned being the major herbicide that is used for controlling fall panicum. And some growers have talked about not seeing good efficacy with Azulam when looking at fall panicum. So did collect some four populations of fall panicum, and then subjected them to different doses of Azulam. So we went all the way up to, I think it was the 2x the label rate. So these graphs are just showing the probability of survival of the fall panicum population when it's treated with Azulam, tank mixed with trifloxysulfuron or without trifloxysulfuron. So, sorry, this is a log scale. That's why it looks kind of, with a log scale, it makes the response look better. But the 1x rate for Azulam would be around here, which is 3,000 grams of active ingredient per acre. And from this, it showed that even, the label use rate, irrespective of the population that we had used, it was still giving very good control. So the EREC population that I put here was from a field that we've never planted cane on. And typically, there might be movement of seeds from adjacent fields, but collected seeds that are pretty sure that was not exposed too much to Azulam. So what I discovered was that, we really don't have issues with fall panicum resistance to Azulam. But one thing with our area here, I mean, if you miss the opportunity to apply a herbicide, let's say even for 2 days, like now that it's raining, I mean, the grasses are going to grow like they're on steroids. And the minute they grow big, then the efficacy of a lot of herbicides usually reduces when the size of the weeds are bigger. But one other thing that I want to look at is to see if there is an influence of water pH or hardness on the efficacy of Azulam. So Azulam is a weak acid, and a lot of weak acid herbicides sometimes are affected by the soil pH the water pH or the water hardness. So a lot of the studies that I do, I get, I use tap water from the city. Our growers, of course, get their water from canals. So something that I'm interested in doing that I've never done since I came here is to look at the effect, what the water pH that they have in the canals, and kind of play around with the different levels of water pH to see how that will affect the efficacy of Azulam. That is a major herbicide that is used to see if that is an issue that growers can, there are products that can be used to condition the water to be either to play around with the pH, so that when making recommendations, then you can tell them that, okay, you need to adjust your carrier pH and so forth to enhance the efficacy of whatever you're applying, especially for azulum. So one other weed species that is becoming a major issue that was never there before is guinea grass. It tends to be, here is a field that is heavily infested with guinea grass. And that's just a field where there's one lump of guinea grass. And one thing with guinea grass is that of all the herbicides that are labeled for use in cane, there is none that I would say that is very effective in managing it. One of my major projects going forward is going to be to study the ecology, biology, and management of guinea grass, and see how we can manipulate the production system to help mitigate its effect. Because if you have a field like this infested by guinea grass, I mean, you're going to take a very heavy hit in terms of your yield. And what I'm projecting is that as we move a lot of our production into the more sandy or mineral soils, particularly fields that used to have citrus, and there'll be a lot more issues with guinea grass. So if you drive through a citrus grove, you'll see a lot of guinea grass, but at least within citrus, there are so many options that, herbicides they can use, like glyphosate and so forth, to apply to control guinea grass. But the minute you move away from that production system and convert that field into a sugarcane field, then you will end up with a situation like that. So one of my goals, with support from the Florida Sugarcane League, there's listed a number of things that I'll be doing, I've started doing, looking at the growth and reproduction of guinea grass populations from different sugarcane production areas. I think collected so far populations, I think there are about 12 or 15 populations to look at. And then also just looking at the emergence patterns of these populations to figure out maybe the best timing to see if it would be easy to control them when they're still pretty small and so forth. And then also just to look at their persistence over time, particularly if they spread into muck soil, to look at how long the seeds would persist, depending on how deep they're buried. But when you look at when preparing land, I mean, with disc and so forth, if burial depth will have an effect. And then for fields that are rotated with rice, what would be the effect of flooding or duration of flooding on the populations or seeds of guinea grass if they moved into muck soil? And then also coming up with some management programs that are there. I did a preliminary study where I looked at the effect of, topremazone plus some of the triazines, applied it to guinea grass when they were small, from about 4 inches was the smallest size, all the way to about 8 inches. And at 4 inches, with a tank mix of topremazone and some of the triazines, it really seemed to be having an effect. So the goal of something like that would be to have the growers, may probably apply it and see what the effect of shading would be if you applied it even as a lay-by, where you have a directed spray. If it's under the sugarcane canopy, would shading be something that can help minimize its growth and reproduction and so forth. So that's a major area of research that I'll be pursuing the next coming years. So some other projects that I'm doing on cane, there is a new compound called pyroxasulfuron that is marketed by BSF. We'll be evaluating it for pre-emergence weed control and also for early post-emergence weed control. For early post-emergence weed control, as a tank mix with topremazone to see how that will work in a production system, and also to look at its persistence in soil, the half-life, and how much of a residual effect it will have. And it's one of the herbicides that we're going to target to see its effect on guinea grass populations if it's applied as a pre-emergence herbicide. Clomazone, it's an old chemistry that's been there. It's used a lot in the Louisiana production system. We don't use it here, but just want to see its effect on weed control and general persistence also in our soils, to give our growers more tools or options that they can use to mitigate the effect of weeds. Then I do work on ripeners too, not too much, but there's a ripener that I'm evaluating. It's called fluopyroxafen. It's a growth regulator. It's an auxin type herbicide that is marketed by Corteva. So they are trying to compare it with things like Modas and glyphosate to see the effect on ripening on sugarcane as a ripener in our market here. So doing small plot trials with it, and I think they're in the process of engaging the growers too. And then there are some foliar nutritional products that are sold by Helena Chemicals that they want to also try out as ripeners that I'll also be evaluating this year. And then there's another weed species that I think a lot of you probably see it along ditches or canals or close to field edges in sugarcane, Columbus grass. So mostly you'll find it next to the field edges. So what I want to look at is ecology and some management options. And in terms of ecology, whether, I'm not a soil scientist, but when you have closer to ditches where you have the limestone bedrock that is way close to the field, there could be issues with pH, but maybe it likes being in areas that have high pH soils compared to, as you move away from ditches and canals, probably you see differences in pH. So those are some of the things that I want to look at. And then lastly, for sugarcane, as we moved into, a lot more green cane harvesting, I want to, over time, look at, weed species shift that we see in our production system and see what options will be there based on some of the herbicide products and management options that we have. Because definitely we'll have a shift in populations if we end up harvesting most of our cane green as compared to now that we ban our cane because of issues with the trash blanket that I mentioned before. So sugarcane, of course, is grown in rotation with several crops here. We have rice, leafy vegetables, and sweet corn in our production system. So I do work on all of these crops. But if you look at the rotations where you have sugarcane, rice, sweet corn, and they're all grass crops. So a lot of these systems, the problem weed will mostly be grass weed. So you move from sugarcane, you have fall panicum, you go to, rice. Main issue is fall panicum. You go to sweet corn, fall panicum is a major issue. So because of the kind of rotation that we have, we sometimes do kind of end up with just getting a lot of grass weeds just because of the system that we do have. So for rice, as I mentioned, fall panicum is still the major weed species. In rice, grasses are, I would say, the most difficult to control. The broadleaf weeds, a lot of them will die even with flood water, so they're typically not that major of an issue. But fall panicum is the major issue. You can see this is a field that is completely taken over by fall panicum. And then there are sprangletopes. There are two different species. There is the bearded sprangletop. Whatever is there is called Amazon sprangletop. And the sprangletopes, you'll only see them in rice because they're aquatic or semi-aquatic plants, and you'll never really see them in other production, in sugarcane or that much. There's a weed called the coast cockspur. It's an echinoclover, so it's kind of a local barnyard grass, and it's also very prevalent in our rice production system. So there's a field of rice, can barely see the rice, heavily infested by coast cockspur. And then yellow nutsedge, I would say, is the major sage species that you'll find associated with the rice production system. So as with rice, I mean, you plant, get seedling emergence, tillering, heading, and maturity. And most of the weed control process, will be from planting to almost when you get that, into the point where tillering occurs during the vegetative phase. So you want to control your weeds, but typically you want to control your weeds at this point before inducing that permanent flood water into your system. So this is a picture showing on this side. See, it looks clean. That's where you have very good control of weeds. The other side, can someone guess what weed species that is? Yes, fall panicum. So this is what happens. So if you drain the water, look at the way tillering here looks nice. And then on the other side where you have fall panicum, you can barely see the rice tillers. So that's how, these weed species become very competitive with rice, affect tillering and so forth. And this is a curve, just show a graph. It's a rectangular hyperbola model showing the effect of different densities of fall panicum on rice yield. And there are two parameters that are used in this model. There is the I parameter, which is the percent yield loss as your density approaches zero. So over here, it's around 10%. So that shows how fall panicum is very competitive with rice, even at very, very low densities. So for this model, fix the asymptote at 100, because you cannot have more than 100% yield loss. Whatever was, without fixing the asymptote, I mean, it was like 118%. So that tells you that, at very high fall panicum densities, you're going to have almost nothing to harvest. So that makes it very critical to be timely on when you control your especially fall panicum in rice, to mitigate any yield losses. So one thing that we do, we start planting rice early in February. Here's a graph, though it's from a couple of years ago. But anytime you start planting rice from February, March, or sometimes into April is during our driest part of the year. In other rice production areas, they do use a lot of pre-emergence herbicides, which in our system here, we don't. When you use pre-emergence herbicides in rice, typically you have to put like a flash flood to incorporate the herbicide in the soil to make it activated and become effective. But our growers, the way our system is set up here, a lot of them don't do that. So one thing that I did with the rice, support from the rice growers, was to look at, planting rice and then spraying some, pendimethalin or clomazone that are pre-emergence herbicides that are used on rice that need to be incorporated into the soil. If you look at production systems like in dry beans where they use pendimethalin for weed control, you can mechanically incorporate this into the soil. And when we plant rice, when it's dry, typically we roll the field. And as you roll the field, I mean, there's some movement of the soil that probably might help with incorporating that. So did a trial, applied pendimethalin and clomazone at different rates, then just, kind of roll the fields to see if that will help incorporate it and maybe help with the growers reduce that initial flush of weeds that you get after planting rice. And this was the results here. Yeah, the number of plants. This was mostly grasses, but it was mostly fall panicum. And as you can see, where nothing was rolled, so we had like a running check, so no pre-emergence product was put. That's the population. Applying that and using when you're doing the rolling the field, kind of incorporates it a little bit. You can see it reduce the population a little bit. But then went back again and applied. So where we had the pre alone, and then went back and applied like a pre followed by a post and a post alone. And if you look at the yield data, let me see, the green is the post alone, the red is the pre plus post, and then the blue is the pre alone. What we saw was that, I mean, there's no added advantage for using the pre's, because if you time your post emergence early enough, then probably using pendimethalin or clomazone really in our system doesn't make that much big of a difference. So that was something interesting that we looked at. There's a new product that we tested here. It's called chloropyroxyfen that I mentioned that is being used as a ripener. It's a herbicide that is labeled for use in rice for controlling grasses, broadleaf weeds, and sedges. A lot of sugarcane ripeners a lot of them are herbicides. So there's one herbicide that is new in the market So there was a study to compare its efficacy when applied alone. Interested in looking at whether it had, any synergistic effect or whether it had any antagonism with some of the products that are presently used in our rice system. And as you can see, where it's in blue, whether it was applied alone or in tank mix with the Cyhalothropis clincher, that's Bazagran, the Sandia or Profine, Cafentrazone, that's AIM. There was not really much antagonism. And even the weed control, where you apply it alone, mostly for fall panicum and yellow nutsedge, kind of compared to the standard that our growers use, which is Cyhalothropis, that is clincher, Sandia, and AIM, or clincher, Bazagran, and AIM, was kind of about the same. So this is an untreated control. This is right before harvesting, and the other side is a new herbicide product. So it's a product that I think is going to be good for our growers to use as we move forward, because it's a new product that has come into the market. The restriction is okay. It's not going to be a major issue for them. So we'll see what the level of adoption would be. And this herbicide, it's an auxin type herbicide like 2,4-D or dicamba. So if you have broadleaf weeds or dicot crops around it, then they will be subject to injuries. So this was did some tests here to look at extra very low rates to kind of simulate a situation where you have a drift on some Endive, Escarole, and radish, and all these crops were really very, very sensitive to it. So for growers who might use it in the future, they will still have to make sure that they make sure that they don't have any vegetable crops that might be susceptible to injury from it. Even though it's a very good product, but let's say rice that is planted late in like May or June when there are no vegetables, then this would be a good product for the growers to use. Many people have asked me, the effect of flooding on certain weeds, some of the weed species. Looked at the effect of flooding on fall panicum. Sorry, the graphs look too busy. But what we found out was the different flooding depths that we looked at, from 10 to 30. Most of our growers, the flooding depth that a lot of the growers use is around 10 centimeters. So at 10 centimeters, irrespective of the size of the fall panicum, there was a reduction in some of the growth parameters that we looked at. But my goal was to look at how it affects the probability of survival of the fall panicum and the different flooding depth and its ability to grow and produce seeds. So at that 10 centimeter flood depth that growers typically use, you're not going to see, you'll see reduction in biomass, but the plants will still be able to give you some seeds. So flooding as a weed management tool should still be used in combination with some of the herbicide products that we have, even but which is not good for the organic rice production point of view, where no herbicides can be used. But for the conventional rice, you flood plus you spray herbicide, then you'll have a very good weed control. Because otherwise you have to flood at more than 20 centimeters depth, which will be almost covering your rice. At that point, that would affect rice, if rice is still very small at that point. So some other project that I'm looking at, I talked about the coast coxpa, remember that? So evaluating this base pyrabic sodium. It's an old herbicide. It's been there in the market. We don't use it that much here, but it's very good for controlling another related species, which is barnyard grass, Canoploa crusgali. The one we have here is a Canoploa walteri. So I had a project that is ongoing. Did some trials this year, conduct another trial next year to see what the effect is going to be on coxpa. And then there's another new herbicide called benzobicyclone. This one is sprayed also on rice, but it's sprayed over a flooded field because it's only activated when it gets into contact with water through hydrolysis. So I'm looking at some efficacy trials. but also I'll be looking at its effect when you look at the flooding depth, especially for fall panicum, and yeah, flooding depth, and also the size of fall panicum to see if that would affect its efficacy. If you apply it on, let's say, on a field like this that is not flooded, it really doesn't have an effect because it has to be activated by water. And then one other thing that I've always been asked is, the effect of duration and of flooding on different seeds with different weeds. I've never done that, and that's something that I plan on doing in the future, just to see if there are other benefits of flooding, if from the weed control point of view, some of the benefits that you can get from flooding a field. Of course, we flood for rice production and to reduce subsidence and all that. But if you can show proof that it will have effect on some of the weeds that are common in our area, then that would be great. Sweet corn, same pictures, same weed species that you'll find in rice and sugarcane. For grasses, fall panicum is going to be the most problematic. Broadleaf weeds, lamb squatter, now nightshade, and some of the amaranth species. So this is just a graph here. It shows the critical period of weed control in sweet corn. So to almost minimize like a 5% yield loss in sweet corn, then you basically have to start controlling the weeds from emergence almost all the way to the R1 stage of growth, which is the silking stage. So for any grower, your goal for weed control in sweet corn is to kind of keep your fields entirely clean through most of the season to really minimize any yield loss that might be there. So for sweet corn, tested some herbicides here. Again, topramazone that I mentioned that is used in cane. It's also used in sweet corn. And then compared pyroxasulfuron that I mentioned that we are evaluating now to see if we can get a label on cane. Compared, it as a pre versus S-metolachlor that is commonly used. So it performed better for fall panicum control. But when you compare it to topramazone, which is opposed, topramazone did better than pyroxasulfuron. It's a better product than mesotrione that is majorly for broadleaf weed control. So it had a 20% better control of fall panicum, better than timbotrione, mesotrione. So I don't want to bog you with all the figures here, but the take-home message here is that pyroxasulfuron does give slightly a better job than S-metolachlor when it comes to mostly grass control and control of some of the broadleaf weeds. And then for the post-emergence, the topramazone still gives you some better weed control, even in sweet corn. So in this study, all these, the topramazone, timbotrione, mesotrione, which are the HPPD inhibitors, were either tank mixed with atrazine or bazagran to enhance the activity. And you can see from the pictures, you get a better control with treatments that contain the topramazone compared to everything else. Yeah. This is just kind of a summary of some of the herbicides that I used. I don't want to bog you down with that, but one project that I want to do, there is a new HPPD herbicide called tolpyrrolate. It's in the same group as topramazone, mesotrione, and timbotrione. Just got registered for use in corn and also sweet corn, but so far it's not sold in our area. I mean, it has a rotation restriction of like 12 months for cane, but I'm sure want to evaluate it and see its effect on cane and all that, and see if we get some good results. Then, I mean, the label can always be changed to kind of fit our production system. So if we can get another PPD herbicide to use in a sweet corn production system, that would be great. And then lettuce. For lettuce, grasses are not that much of an issue. The major issue is mostly broadleaf weeds, because with grass control in lettuce, there are herbicides that can easily control lettuce. This is a small study we did to look at also the critical period of weed control in lettuce based on different rates of phosphorus fertilization. And what we saw was that the critical period of weed control was kind of shortened when you have more nutrients, because there's more nutrients for the crops and the weeds. But so this would be the recommended, the 1x rate for PUs. And if you go by, if you increase that, then your window for controlling weeds, becomes shorter, because probably there are more nutrients for the crops to compete for. So the major issues for lettuce are mostly broadleaf weeds. And if you look at the herbicide, we only have one herbicide for use in lettuce. For grasses, the cethoxidime works perfect to eliminate grass weeds in lettuce. So we tried some pre-emergence herbicide, pronomide, benzoate, and oxyfluorophane, compared to the imazethopyr, which is currently the only herbicide that we have. I don't know if you can see from the pictures, this is a pre for the imazethopyr, the post, if you do a pre plus post. But all those herbicides, the two of them are used in the California production system. So like the pronomide, the pre really doesn't look good. So you have to follow it with an imazethopyr. And that's the same too with benzoate. So the imazethopyr still did a better job than some of those two products that are used. So imazethopyr is good on Smignum and common lamb's quarter, but it's not very good on common purslane that is becoming a major issue here. So one of the things I want to look at, is there an influence of also carrier water pH and water hardness, because imazethopyr is also a weak acid. And then right now there's a project that funded by the specialty cropland, where we'll be looking at pendimethalin as a potential product to use. And I'll have Walter Wang, an MS student, who will be working on that. And what we'll be looking at will just be evaluating common purslane control and different lettuce variety response to pendimethalin, see the effect of that. And then, the effect of temperature, moisture, and so forth on its seed recruitment processes, including germination
It really varies depending on the calcium content and the carbonates content, so it varies quite a bit, but it's above 7 for sure, yeah.
Yeah, and I talked about pH for a product like Azulam kind of requires more of slightly acidic condition to be effective. You know, if the pH is very high, then really it doesn't perform very well. Yes.
Calvin, I had another question. So for the organic rice, you touched on it a little bit. There is nothing allowable for organic rice production in terms of herbicide control. What do they do?
So for organic rice, yeah, there's nothing that is allowed. They mostly, I think, a lot of it they plant it early when it's dry before weeds pop up, and then they flood. And let me go back here. Let me see if I can go back. Oops. Yeah, so there's no one from Crystal. So that's an organic rice field. That's one of the things that they always say, because organic rice, you know, the premium is good. So if you have like coast coxswath like that, then you don't get a lot of bad damage, because they'll stick on the weeds. And then whatever they get out of the crop, I mean, because it's premium is higher, they're still able to break even. Yes, sir.
The common like trade name for that, or
Oh, the trade name?
yeah.
It's called Regiment.
Okay, that's
So it's an ALS inhibitor. So it's in the same group as halosalpiron, Sandia, and the rest.
Let's get a question or two from folks on Zoom.
One question is, are there high variation in herbicide preference for herbicides used among the growers you work with? And then second question, any issues of herbicide impact on crop plants, especially related to environmental conditions such as temperatures?
So the first one is, are there high? The variation is not going to be that much, because majority of growers are going to use, you know, the same herbicide if they have good efficacy. So most of the commons that herbicides that I use are going to be about similar. If you're looking at sugarcane, or let's say you're looking at sweet corn or snap bean or anything like that, yeah. And then the next one.
Any issues of herbicide impact on crop plants, especially related to environmental conditions such as temperatures?
Impact of herbicide on croplands, things. Majority of the herbicides that are used on the crops have been evaluated for safety. So that's one of the things that when I do herbicide evaluation trials, look at the efficacy and crop safety. So most of them, I mean, but sometimes depending on the temperature, product like metribuzin or amitrine that are used on cane, if it's, you know, dry and the plant is stressed, you can see damage or some injury to the crop. And that's true for several different herbicides. When the plant is stressed, then your chances of seeing some injury will be high. But on the other side, you know, the weed control might not also be good, because if the weeds are also stressed, then they are not going to take up the herbicide. So yeah, so temperature and so forth will have an effect sometimes if it's extreme. Yeah.
Thank you for the nice presentation. I have one question. We do see lots of, how do I say, maiden cane? I think that is the Napier grass. Do you have any suggestions for that?
So they see a lot of Napier grass in their cane. Unfortunately, Napier grass is one of those weed species that there is no selective herbicide that in sugarcane that can be used to control it. And one of the better options to manage it is, if you don't have a very large population, then it's easier to just go and spot spray with glyphosate in the spots where they are, to minimize the expansion. But nothing else works. But just spot spraying would be the best option. Yeah.
Calvin, do you know if any herbicides being used on sugarcane may have residual effect on the rotation crops? followed by sugarcane, or vice versa? Like if it's used on rotation crop and it has effect on sugarcane?
There, I can list herbicides. So depending on the label, yeah, there are herbicides. Mostly it's I would say the sugarcane herbicide that, let's say like atrazine. If you use atrazine, you're not going to follow it with, let's say, something like lettuce. But a lot of products, if you look at the rotational restriction, because sugarcane is not a major crop, so it always ends up in the other. And I mean, sugarcane is vegetatively propagated, and most of the residual effects that you see from herbicides that have been used prior would be related to, affecting seedlings that are germinating. If you're growing sugarcane from a stalk, your chances of having that, residual effect or whatever product that is there is going to be very, very limited. So I'll give you an example. So topramazone, before it was registered for use in cane, the rotational restriction was 12 months. But yeah, that was just because topramazone was, compound that was used in the corn production system, and sugarcane is not in that area, so it would always fall under other crops. But majority of herbicides based on the vegetative propagation or nature of cane are not really going to have that much of an effect. But the registrants, because they don't work with sugarcane, so sugarcane always ends up being lumped up with other crops.
Last question. Anyone? Okay. Thank you very much, Calvin.
Thank you. Gosh.